Southern France, September 1944. The man who staggered down the narrow street did not look like a threat. His steps were uneven. His shoulders sagged. His jacket hung loose, stained with wine and dust. To anyone watching from a window or a doorway, he appeared exactly as thousands of displaced men had looked in the final year of the war. Exhausted, defeated and half-drunk on whatever could still be found. His breath came heavy, his head dipped forward, and his balance seemed perpetually on the edge of collapse. The German headquarters ahead of him was lit but quiet. A requisitioned stone building, once municipal offices, now sealed behind sandbags and iron discipline. Inside were maps, schedules, troop dispositions, information that dictated where armored units would move, which roads would be held, and which bridges would be destroyed before Allied forces could reach them. It was not meant to be vulnerable. It was not meant to be accessible, and yet that night, it was. The sentries saw what they expected to see. Another civilian pushed to the margins of a collapsing occupation. Another harmless problem, best processed quickly and dismissed. The war had trained them to watch for weapons, uniforms, confidence. It had not trained them to recognize deliberate weakness as camouflage. The man slowed as he approached the entrance. His posture folded inward, as if gravity itself were pressing him down. He paused just long enough for irritation to register among the guards. Delays were common, drunks were common. Paperwork was endless. The front lines were shifting faster than orders could be rewritten, and command posts like this one were overwhelmed with fragments of a war that was no longer going to plan. What the guards could not see was calculation. Behind the unfocused stare was a mind operating under strict control. Every movement had been rehearsed, not in front of a mirror, but under training that emphasized exhaustion, fear, and improvisation. The Office of Strategic Services had learned early that intelligence was rarely taken by force. It was taken by permission, distraction, and assumption. This operative had been shaped for precisely that moment, where the difference between success and capture would be measured in seconds of misjudgment. Inside the building, officers worked under low light. Maps were pinned and repinned. Colored lines overlapped in confusion as German units attempted to respond to breakthroughs that no longer followed predictable patterns. The war here was not being lost with explosions. It was being lost with delays, wrong assumptions, and information arriving too late. The operative crossed the threshold. No alarm sounded. No weapons were raised. The door closed behind him with the dull certainty of normalcy. Within those walls, entire sections of the German operational picture lay exposed, not because of carelessness, but because the system itself no longer imagined that deception could arrive wearing defeat. Files were stacked for reference. Tables were left populated with documents meant to be reviewed again within the hour. The headquarters was functioning as designed, and that design assumed the enemy would announce himself with force. This one did not. Time narrowed. Each step deeper into the building compressed the margin for error. The operative's senses sharpened, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, where memory and observation aligned with training. Routes were noted. Hands remembered textures. Pages were weighed not by their words alone, but by how much strategic damage they could inflict once removed. What would be taken that night would not end the war, but it would bend it, because wars do not turn only on battlefields. They turn in rooms like this, when someone is allowed inside who was never meant to be there. By the time Allied forces pushed into southern France, the war had already begun to shift away from brute force and toward information dominance. Bombers and artillery still mattered, but their effectiveness increasingly depended on knowing where to strike, when to move, and which enemy units were already hollowed out by exhaustion or misdirection. This was the terrain where intelligence decided outcomes long before troops made contact. The organization responsible for exploiting that terrain was the Office of Strategic Services. Unlike conventional military branches, its doctrine rejected uniformity and predictability. Operatives were trained not to look capable, but forgettable, not to intimidate, but to be dismissed. Their greatest asset was not courage alone, but the ability to disappear inside enemy expectations. Training emphasized collapse scenarios rather than victory scenarios. Agents learned how soldiers behaved when they were tired, how guards behaved when routines replaced vigilance, and how bureaucracies behaved when pressure forced speed over verification. Alcohol, fatigue, and social irritation were studied not as vices, but as tools. The goal was never to overpower the system, but to move through it without triggering its defenses. On the German side, the command structure in occupied territories had grown increasingly rigid. Layers of approval multiplied as distrust of local populations increased. Headquarters were often relocated into repurposed civic buildings, town halls, administrative offices, schools, structures never designed for military secrecy. These spaces were defended physically, but operationally exposed, relying on assumptions rather than constant verification. As the front lines fractured, German staff officers were inundated with partial information. Rail disruptions, fuel shortages, and inconsistent communications created an environment where outdated orders remained on tables longer than intended. Maps overlapped with amendments. Handwritten notes corrected printed directives. The volume of information became a liability. In such conditions, security protocols bent under the weight of urgency. OSS planners understood this imbalance. They knew that as pressure increased, the enemy's focus narrowed. Guards were trained to identify threats that matched a mental template: armed men, organized resistance, sudden violence. A solitary civilian displaying confusion, weakness, or intoxication fell outside that template. Processing him became an administrative nuisance, not a tactical concern. The operative sent toward the headquarters was selected not for rank, but for adaptability. He carried no weapon that would define him as a combatant. His value lay in observation, memory, and timing. He needed to recognize which documents mattered instantly, without the luxury of prolonged study. He needed to extract information in minutes that normally took analysts weeks to piece together. Inside German command culture, paperwork was authority. Orders written and stamped carried more weight than verbal updates from the field. That culture created an opening. If plans existed on paper in a room accessible even briefly, they could be replicated, removed, or memorized with devastating effect. This was the quiet asymmetry of the late war. Germany still fielded divisions, tanks, and aircraft, but it increasingly fought blind. The Allies, by contrast, were learning to see without being seen. The incident unfolding in southern France was not an anomaly. It was a refinement of doctrine, a proof that the most secure doors were often guarded by habit, not suspicion. And once habit replaced doubt, all it took was one man who understood how to look exactly like he did not belong. The interior of the headquarters carried the dull orderliness of a system stretched thin. Walls that once held municipal notices were now lined with maps pinned at uneven angles. Desks bore the layered sediment of a prolonged campaign. Folders, folded reports, pencil-marked overlays. The air smelled of paper, oil, and stale heat, from generators that worked longer than designed. Nothing about the room suggested urgency, yet everything inside it existed because urgency had already become routine. The operative moved without direction that could be traced. His pace remained inconsistent, his posture loose, his attention outwardly unfocused. To anyone glancing up, he appeared to be waiting for instruction, or perhaps struggling to understand where he had been placed. That ambiguity was intentional. Confusion invited neglect. Neglect created opportunity. Time inside enemy spaces did not pass evenly. Each second carried a different weight, depending on who was watching and who was not. The operative understood this instinctively. He did not search the room. He let the room reveal itself. Command environments betrayed their priorities through what they left exposed. The most valuable material was rarely locked away. It was kept close, accessible, assumed to be safe through proximity rather than protection. At the central table, large-scale maps dominated the space. Roads were marked in thick lines. Rail junctions were circled. Arrows indicated projected movements, some tentative, others reinforced with repeated annotations. These were not theoretical exercises. They were contingency plans responding to Allied pressure, moving faster than German command anticipated. The operative registered these details in fragments. He did not attempt to memorize everything. He isolated what mattered: concentrations of force, timelines, and withdrawal thresholds. He recognized patterns from prior briefings. Units repositioned not to attack, but to delay. Defensive belts drawn not for permanence, but to buy time. The war here was no longer about victory. It was about control of retreat. Around him, staff officers moved in and out, focused inward, eyes drawn to their own tasks. Their behavior reflected institutional confidence. This was a controlled space, a node of authority in an otherwise unstable region. No one expected disruption from within. That assumption allowed proximity without scrutiny. The operative adjusted his position closer to the table, under the pretense of instability. His hand brushed the edge of the map. The texture, the weight, the paper quality, each detail confirmed authenticity. These were current documents, not summaries, not outdated reproductions. The presence of handwritten amendments told him that decisions were still being revised in real time. The margin for error narrowed further. He identified a subset of documents, placed slightly apart from the rest. Their separation indicated priority. These pages dealt with upcoming movements, not past actions. Bridge demolitions, roadblocks, timetables tied to fuel constraints. The kind of information that once known could transform uncertainty into advantage. Extraction did not require spectacle. It required precision. The operative did not clear the table. He selected. He folded with care. He positioned documents where absence would not be noticed immediately. Every movement was calibrated to appear accidental, inconsequential. Noise was the enemy. Silence was the ally. The headquarters continued functioning around him, unaware that its operational center had been compromised not by attack, but by presence. When the operative stepped away from the table, the balance had already shifted. The plans that shaped German responses in the region were no longer secure. They were in transition, carried not by radio or courier, but by a man whose greatest weapon was invisibility. What remained was escape. Leaving a place was often more dangerous than entering it. Inside the headquarters, the operative's presence had been absorbed into routine. His exit would disrupt it. Movement outward drew attention. Doors were thresholds where assumptions were tested, where guards were forced to evaluate rather than ignore. The success of the operation depended not on speed, but on continuity, maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. The documents were concealed without urgency. Their weight altered his balance, subtly but noticeably. That imbalance was useful. It reinforced the performance. The uneven gait, the delayed reactions, the apparent struggle to remain upright. Each detail remained consistent with the persona that had granted him access. Consistency was survival. The corridor narrowed toward the exit. Light shifted. Sound carried differently. Footsteps echoed just enough to register presence without inviting inspection. The operative slowed deliberately, allowing impatience to replace suspicion. Guards conditioned by long hours and repetitive tasks were more likely to wave through a nuisance than confront it. At the threshold, the margin collapsed to seconds. Security protocols existed, but they relied on compliance and clarity. Questions required answers. Answers required attention. That night, Attention was in short supply. The war pressed from every direction. Reports arrived faster than they could be processed. An unremarkable civilian, leaving a building, did not compete with that pressure. The operative's behavior invited dismissal. His head remained low, his movements lacked confidence. He presented as someone already defeated by circumstance. That image carried its own authority. Occupying forces learned early that power did not need to be exerted on those who no longer resisted. The door opened, cold air struck his face. The street beyond appeared unchanged, dim, narrow, ordinary. Yet the moment carried irreversible consequence. If stopped, if searched, the documents would expose not only the operation but the network behind it. Capture would not end in imprisonment. It would end in disappearance. No such interruption came. The door closed behind him with the same sound it had made earlier. The headquarters resumed its work, unaware that its operational center had been hollowed out. Inside, officers continued refining plans that no longer belonged exclusively to them. The damage would not be discovered immediately. It would be felt later, when movements were anticipated and countered with unnerving precision. The operative did not accelerate. He did not look back. Distance was gained through normalcy, not haste. Each step away from the building diluted risk, until the street absorbed him completely. Within hours, the information would reach Allied intelligence channels. Analysts would not marvel at how it was obtained. They would focus on how it could be used. Bridges would be spared or destroyed, accordingly. Ambushes would meet forces where retreat had been planned. Defensive lines would be bypassed rather than assaulted. This was the breaking point, not for the operative, but for the enemy's control of the region. The war would continue, battles would still be fought. But somewhere in the shifting patterns of Allied advance, a quiet absence in a German headquarters would begin to matter. The value of the documents was not measured in pages, but in timing. Within Allied intelligence channels, the material moved quickly and without ceremony. It was not treated as a miracle, nor as a singular triumph. It was processed as confirmation, evidence that the enemy's intentions were now visible in ways that had previously required inference and guesswork. The information fit too cleanly into existing fragments to be coincidence. It closed gaps. It resolved contradictions. It gave shape to uncertainty. Operational planners adjusted without public acknowledgement. Units advanced where resistance was weakest, not where it was loudest. Supply routes avoided planned demolitions. Reconnaissance confirmed withdrawals before they occurred. German forces encountered Allied movements that felt anticipatory rather than reactive. The effect was cumulative. Each correct decision compounded the sense that secrecy had evaporated. On the German side, the loss was not immediately recognized. Headquarters staff continued working from assumptions that no longer held. Orders were followed precisely, yet outcomes diverged from expectation. Defensive measures were bypassed. Reinforcements arrived too late. Retreats collided with obstacles that should not have existed. The command structure responded by tightening discipline, not realizing that discipline had never been the vulnerability. This incident did not change the war by itself. No single operation ever did. Its significance lay in what it demonstrated, that intelligence dominance no longer depended on scale but on precision. One individual, correctly placed, could achieve what entire formations could not. The battlefield was expanding into spaces that uniforms and weapons could not fully control. For Allied intelligence doctrine, the operation reinforced a principle already forming. Success did not require constant heroics. It required patience, observation, and an understanding of human systems under strain. The most effective operatives were those who could exploit routine, fatigue, and assumption without drawing attention to themselves. The man who walked into the headquarters did not receive public recognition. His name did not become legend. that absence was deliberate. Visibility was the opposite of his craft. His contribution was absorbed into reports, adjustments, and quiet successes that left no single signature. In the post-war years, historians would examine outcomes rather than methods. Advances that appeared effortless on maps would be traced back to intelligence advantages gained weeks earlier. The record would show that German plans had been known, countered and rendered obsolete before they could fully unfold. The legacy of the operation endured not in memory, but in methodology. It shaped how intelligence agencies approached access, deception, and human behavior long after the war ended. It stood as a reminder that power was not always asserted through force. Sometimes it was exercised by being allowed inside. The door had been left open, not by mistake, but by habit. And that was enough.